My nephew gave me an ultimatum: either put him in my will as the sole heir, or he would sell the house I'd lived in my whole life and stick me in the cheapest nursing home he could possibly find. So I did exactly what he wanted. I called my lawyer and put him in my will, right on video. He thought he was coming to take control of my assets, but he had no idea he was about to become the star of my life's greatest masterpiece of revenge. Say, title: my nephew threatened to abandon me if I didn't put him in my will, so I did on video. Aunt Frances, this is just magnificent, David said, gesturing with his fork at the platter of chicken. You really shouldn't go to all this trouble for us. We worry. Susan nodded, her expression a careful mask of concern. He's right, Frances. You need to be saving your energy. Let us take care of you. I offered them the same gentle, placid smile I'd been perfecting for 78 years. It was the smile of a woman who didn't make waves, who accommodated, who understood her place. Oh, hush now, the both of you. It's a joy to have my family at my table. What's an old woman to do with her time otherwise? I said, playing my part perfectly. They exchanged a look I knew well, a fleeting, satisfied glance that said, she gets it. She's no trouble. The conversation drifted, as it always did, toward my well-being, which was their shorthand for my finances. Susan ran a manicured finger along the rim of her porcelain plate, her eyes scanning the room. This house holds so many memories, doesn't it? She mused. That beautiful grandfather clock in the hall. Arthur's father brought that over from the old country, didn't he? It was a statement, not a question. A gentle laying of claim. Arthur did cherish it, I replied, my voice even. I refused to cede an inch. He had a wonderful eye for things that last. My focus was on my husband, a gentle reminder that these things were his, and by extension, mine to protect. The loyalty I owed was to his memory, not to their ambitions. Later, over coffee in the living room, they continued their delicate campaign. Have you thought any more about what we discussed last week? David asked, stirring his coffee with one of my silver spoons. About getting your affairs in order. It's just practical, Aunt Frances, at your age. I patted his hand, my touch meant to seem frail and reassuring. I have, dear. In fact, I've been spending my afternoons in Arthur's old office tidying up. So many papers, it's like putting together a puzzle from a long time ago. Again, that quick, hungry look passed between them. They saw a sentimental old widow lost in dusty memories. They didn't see a strategist reviewing a 50-year archive of financial statements, property deeds, and investment portfolios. They couldn't imagine I was the one who had balanced the books for Arthur's small but successful accounting firm for 4 decades. My name never on the door, but my hand in every ledger. A slight chill had crept into the room as the sun dipped lower, and I felt the familiar ache in my shoulders. I believe I'll go fetch my shawl, I announced slowly, pushing myself up from the floral armchair. It's in the bedroom. I moved down the hallway, my steps soft on the runner. I was halfway there when their voices, now stripped of their polite veneer, drifted from the living room. They must have thought I was out of earshot. Did you see how she looked at me when I mentioned the clock? Susan's voice was sharp, a brittle thing. She's still holding on so tight. She acts like we're trying to rob her. Just be patient, honey. David's voice was low and firm. We had the talk. We made the stakes clear. The lawyer appointment is on the books. It's just a matter of time before she does the right thing. There was a pause. I froze my hand, hovering near the bedroom doorknob. Then Susan asked the question that changed everything. And if she gets stubborn, if she decides to be difficult? What then, David? His voice, when it came, was stripped of all warmth. It was cold, hard, and utterly ruthless. Then she forces our hand, he said. If she doesn't change that will and put me down as the sole heir, we're done. We sell this house to cover her expenses, and we stick her in the cheapest state-run home we can find. She'll be all alone. Let's see how she likes that. I stood perfectly still in the dimming hallway, the world seeming to shrink to the space of that single, cruel threat. The gentle, accommodating grandmother they thought they knew, the quiet widow, vanished in that instant. The chill I'd felt moments before had nothing to do with the evening air. It was the ice of absolute clarity. In her place, something else began to stir. Something they had never seen. Something they could never have imagined. After they left that Sunday, the silence in my house felt different. It wasn't the lonely, hollow silence I'd grown used to since Arthur passed. It was a dense, charged quiet, like the air before a storm. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. The shock of my nephew's words had burned away all the soft, grieving parts of me and left something hard and clear in their place. It was a strange kind of gift, really. For the first time in 2 years, I knew exactly what I had to do. That night, I didn't sleep. I went into Arthur's office, the room I had mostly kept closed, and turned on the green glass banker's lamp on his desk. The room smelled of him, of old paper leather, and faint pipe tobacco. For hours I sat in his big chair, not tidying, but working. I pulled out the heavy ledgers I hadn't touched in years, the files on our stocks, the deeds to our properties, the thick folder detailing the trust he'd set up for me. For 40 years, I was the silent partner in his life's work, the one who saw every decimal point, who understood every clause. My hands, which my family saw as useful only for baking and knitting, moved with a forgotten certainty. They thought I was a relic. They'd forgotten I was an accountant's wife. More than that, I was an accountant's partner. A few days later, David called, his voice thick with false concern. He wanted to know how I was feeling, if I needed anything. I told him I was just fine, thank you for asking. I could almost hear him ticking a box on his mental checklist. Grandma is still clueless. The plan is working. They had no idea that their cruel little whisper had been a declaration of war. A war they couldn't possibly know how to fight, because they didn't even know the terrain. They decided to visit again that Saturday. They said they wanted to bring me some things from the market, but I knew what it really was. It was a reconnaissance mission. They needed to make sure their asset, me, was secure. They walked in with bags of groceries I didn't need and a whole lot of smiles that didn't reach their eyes. We sat in the living room and I served them iced tea. The whole time, Susan's eyes kept darting around the room taking inventory. Her gaze lingered on the paintings, the porcelain figurines, and then, inevitably, it settled on the magnificent grandfather clock that stood in the hall. It was a breathtaking piece of cherry wood and polished brass, a family heirloom that had chimed on the hour for over 100 years. It was Arthur's most prized possession from his side of the family. Susan got up and walked over to it, running her hand down its side with a proprietary air. She turned back to me, her smile wide and confident. She told me how they'd been clearing out their foyer, making a special place for the clock. She said it was going to be the centerpiece of their home, and that David's children would be so thrilled to have a piece of their great-grandfather's history with them. She wasn't asking. She was announcing the terms of its surrender. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, letting the silence stretch. I let them sit in that moment of absolute certainty, that moment where they believed they held all the power. I watched the smug satisfaction on David's face as his wife laid claim to a piece of my husband's soul. Finally, I set my glass down on its coaster with a soft click. I looked at Susan and gave her a small, almost apologetic smile. I told her I was afraid that just wasn't going to be possible. The smiles on their faces faltered. They looked at each other confused. David asked what I meant. Why not? I kept my voice soft and even, the tone you'd use to discuss the weather. I explained that I'd sold it. Last week, actually. I told them a lovely antiques collector from Richmond had come by a man who specialized in pre-war timepieces. I mentioned how thrilled he was with the clock's condition and how he'd assured me it would be the prized piece in his collection. You could have heard a pin drop. Susan's jaw literally fell open. David's face, which had been so smug just moments before, began to turn a blotchy shade of red. The first words out of his mouth were sputtering, incredulous. He asked how I could do that. How could I sell it without asking them? He said it was a family heirloom, his family's heirloom. The implication was clear: it was never really mine. I was just its temporary keeper. Here it was. The first test. I met his angry gaze without flinching. I leaned forward slightly, my voice still gentle, but now edged with something they'd never heard before: an unbreakable firmness. I reminded him that the clock was Arthur's property, and upon his passing, it legally became my property. I told him that as far as I knew, a person still had the right to manage their own affairs. Then I added the finishing touch, that little bit of Southern grace that feels like a slap. I said, "Bless your heart, David, I do wish I'd known you were so attached to it. But the papers are all signed and it was picked up on Tuesday." They were utterly stunned. It was like they were seeing me for the first time. The frail, docile old woman they had so carefully managed had just made a major financial decision without them. She had taken something they considered theirs and liquidated it. The panic started to flicker in their eyes. If I could sell the clock, what else could I sell? The foundation of their entire plan, their assumption of my helplessness, had just cracked right down the middle. They left soon after that. There were no more smiles, no more offers of help, just clipped, angry goodbyes. The grocery bags sat on my kitchen counter, a pathetic tribute to their failed mission. After the front door closed and I heard their car pull away in a hurry, the house was quiet again. But this time it was a victorious quiet. I felt calm, focused. I walked into Arthur's office, picked up the telephone, and dialed a number from his old leather-bound address book. A calm, professional voice answered on the other end. I didn't hesitate. I said, "Mr. Albright, it's Frances Miller. I'm calling to confirm our appointment for this coming Thursday at 10. Yes, I'm quite sure. I'm ready to proceed with everything we discussed." The week after the incident with the clock was quiet. Too quiet. The angry phone calls stopped. The surprise visits ceased. It was a cold, deliberate silence, the kind people use when they're planning their next move. I knew they hadn't given up. They had just retreated to come up with a new strategy. My little display of independence had rattled them, but I knew they would misinterpret it. They wouldn't see it as a calculated warning shot. They'd see it as a symptom of a confused old woman lashing out. Their arrogance was my greatest asset, and I was counting on it. The summons came on a Wednesday. It was David, his voice falsely gentle, telling me they needed to have a family meeting. Not a friendly visit, a meeting. He said they'd be over on Saturday afternoon to talk about my future and my well-being. It sounded so caring, but I knew what it was. It was an ambush. They arrived looking like a corporate raiding party. No smiles this time, just grim, serious faces. They sat me down in my own living room on the floral sofa that suddenly felt like an interrogation bench. David took the lead, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his expression a perfect blend of pity and authority. He told me they were worried, deeply worried. The business with the clock, he said, was a huge red flag. It was impulsive. It showed I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Susan chimed in, her voice dripping with condescending sympathy, talking about how common it was for people my age to start having memory lapses to make erratic decisions. They used words like vulnerable and confused. They told me I needed to be protected from myself, from people who might try to take advantage of my good nature. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. Their strategy was clear: to gaslight me into believing I was incompetent, to make me doubt my own mind so that I would hand them control on a silver platter. They presented their solution as if it were a generous, loving act. They had already spoken to their lawyer, they said, a very nice man who specialized in elder care. They wanted to make an appointment for all of us to go see him. The goal, David explained, was to set things up so he could help me manage my finances, maybe get him power of attorney just to take the burden off my shoulders. This was the moment. This was the scene I had been rehearsing in my mind. I let my shoulders slump. I looked down at my hands, twisting the handkerchief I held. I allowed a tremor to enter my voice. I told them that maybe they were right, that the world was so complicated now, and that ever since Arthur was gone, I felt so lost. I let a single tear roll down my cheek, a masterful touch, if I do say so myself. I looked up at David, my eyes full of the manufactured fear and confusion they expected to see. I told him that if he thought it was for the best, then I would do it. I would see the lawyer. I just wanted my family to be happy and for me to be safe. Victory washed over their faces. They relaxed. Susan reached out and patted my arm, telling me I was doing the right thing. David assured me it would all be for the best and that he would handle everything. They left my house that day feeling completely triumphant, convinced they had put the senile old woman back in her box. They had no idea they had just walked away from a battle they had already lost. The very next Monday morning, I was not at home waiting for their call. I was downtown. I wore my best navy blue suit, the one I used to wear to the bank for important meetings with Arthur. I walked not into some suburban elder law office, but into the polished marble lobby of Albright, Finley, and Reed, one of the most respected estate law firms in the state. I was shown into a large boardroom with a view of the entire city. Waiting for me at the long mahogany table was not just Mr. Albright Arthur's trusted friend and lawyer for 50 years, but also a kind-faced woman in her 60s. Mr. Albright introduced her as Eleanor Gable, the executive director of the hospice that had cared for Arthur with such dignity in his final months. There was no talk of my confusion or my vulnerability. There was only respect. Mr. Albright laid out a stack of documents, his demeanor all business. "Everything is prepared as you instructed, Francis," he said. And so, while my nephew was likely congratulating himself on his cleverness, I was busy signing the papers that created the Arthur Miller Legacy Trust. While they were planning how to control my money, I was transferring every significant asset, the stocks, the bonds, the proceeds from the clock, and 2 other pieces of art I'd sold privately, into that irrevocable trust. My hand was firm, my signature clear and strong on every single page. When the signing was done, Mr. Albright had one last task. An associate brought in a small professional video camera and set it on a tripod at the end of the table. Mr. Albright adjusted the lens, then looked at me. Mrs. Gable from the hospice gave me a reassuring smile. "Are you ready, Francis?" Mr. Albright asked quietly. I straightened my suit jacket and looked directly into the dark, unblinking eye of the camera. The gentle, frail grandmother was gone. In her place sat a woman who knew her own mind, her own worth, and her own power. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I am." The 2 days after my secret meeting with Mr. Albright were the most peaceful I'd had in years. I tended to my garden. I baked a lemon pound cake just because I wanted to. The house felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its very foundation. The ticking of the kitchen clock was no longer a countdown to my own demise, but a steady, reassuring rhythm, marking the moments of my reclaimed life. I knew with the certainty of a well-executed plan that the official letter from Albright, Finley, and Reed had been sent by courier that morning. It was scheduled to arrive at my nephew's polished suburban home right around lunchtime. I pictured the crisp, heavy envelope landing on his marble countertop, an elegant paper bomb waiting to detonate his world. The call came at precisely 12:47 p.m. I was sitting at my kitchen table enjoying a slice of my cake with a cup of tea when the phone rang with a shrill insistence that told me everything. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. "Hello," I said, my voice as mild as the afternoon sun. It was David, but it wasn't the voice I knew. Gone was the smooth, condescending tone of our last meeting. Gone was the false gentleness. What came through the line was a raw, strangled sound, a mix of fury and utter disbelief. He didn't even say hello. He just exploded, demanding to know who in God's name was Albright Finley and Reed, and why were they sending him letters. He sounded like a man who had just seen a ghost. I took a slow sip of tea before answering. I told him ever so politely that Mr. Albright was an old friend of Arthur's, a very respected lawyer. I mentioned that I was surprised David had received a letter, but I was sure it was just a formality. This, of course, was like throwing gasoline on a fire. He started shouting, then his voice cracking with strain. He was reading from the letter, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic cascade. He read about the establishment of the Arthur Miller Legacy Trust. He choked on the words, irrevocable charitable trust. He kept repeating the phrase, majority of liquid assets, his voice getting higher with each repetition. I could picture him perfectly standing in his pristine kitchen, his face turning a dark mottled red, the thick, expensive paper trembling in his hand. Then came the accusations. He started yelling that I'd been tricked, that some slick lawyer had taken advantage of a confused old woman. He told me not to worry, that he would fix it. He would get his own lawyer, a better one, and they would sue this Mr. Albright into the ground for manipulating me. He was still operating under the delusion that he was my protector, that this was something that had happened to me, not by me. He simply could not compute the reality that the gentle, simple-minded old aunt he had so carefully managed was capable of such a thing. I let him rant. I let him exhaust his fury and his accusations. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke again, my voice still infuriatingly calm. I told him that no one had taken advantage of me. I explained that I had been the one to contact Mr. Albright. I had been the one to give the instructions. I had signed all the papers myself. There was a dead silence on the other end of the phone. Not a calm silence like the one in my house, but a stunned, airless void. I had just taken away his last, most precious assumption, my incompetence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a choked whisper. He asked if I had any idea what irrevocable meant. I do, I said softly. It was a vocabulary word of Arthur's. It means it cannot be undone. Not by you, not by me, not by anyone. That was the moment the ground gave way beneath him. The anger was replaced by pure, undiluted panic. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. All his plans, all his threats, all his maneuvering, it was all for nothing. The money he had already spent in his mind was gone. The future he had built on the foundation of my inheritance had just been wiped from existence. He wasn't yelling anymore. He was making small, desperate sounds, the whimpers of a man who has been completely and totally outplayed. He started talking about the appointment with his lawyer, the one he had arranged for me. He tried to tell me we still had to go, that we could fix this. David, I said, and my voice was no longer gentle. It was as cold and hard as polished stone. There is nothing to fix. You wanted me to get my affairs in order, so I did. I could hear Susan in the background now, her voice a shrill shriek, asking what was wrong, what had happened. I heard him tell her, his voice a dead monotone. It's gone. It's all gone. He said my name one last time, a question, a plea, a curse, all rolled into one. Before he could say anything else, I did something I had never done in my entire life. I hung up the phone on him. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, the only sound the steady ticking of the clock. The earthquake had struck. Their world had been turned upside down. Their assumptions shattered, their power revealed to be nothing but a fragile illusion. For them, it was the end of everything. For me, it was just the beginning. The real reckoning, the public one, was still to come, and I was very much looking forward to it. After the chaos of that phone call, a week of profound silence followed. It was the silence of a chessboard after a devastating move, with one side in stunned disarray and the other waiting calmly for the final inevitable checkmate. David didn't call back. There were no more texts, no more surprise visits. They were reeling, trying to understand how the board had been so completely flipped. But I knew that as long as my will remained technically unfinalized, they would cling to a desperate sliver of hope. So I had Mr. Albright send them one final invitation. Not a legal summons, but a polite formal request to attend a meeting at his office on Friday morning to provide final clarification regarding my estate. It was the last piece of bait, and I knew they were too desperate not to take it. I dressed for the occasion in the same navy blue suit I had worn to sign the trust documents. It felt like my armor. I arrived at the law office 30 minutes early and was shown into the same boardroom. Mrs. Gable, the director from the hospice, was already there, her presence a quiet pillar of support. Mr. Albright greeted me with a warm, respectful nod. We sat for a moment, the three of us a silent alliance, bound by a common purpose to honor my husband's legacy. When David and Susan arrived, they looked like ghosts of their former selves. They were pale, drawn, their usual confident swagger replaced by a twitchy, nervous energy. Their eyes darted around the room, taking in the expensive wood paneling, the imposing view of the city, and settling on Mrs. Gable with a mixture of confusion and hostility. Why was she here? They looked at me, a desperate pleading question in their eyes, still hoping this was all a nightmare they could negotiate their way out of. I gave them a small, polite nod and gestured for them to sit. Mr. Albright began the meeting, his voice the epitome of professional decorum. He stated that we were gathered at my request to ensure there was no ambiguity regarding my final wishes. David started to speak, to make a direct appeal to me, but Mr. Albright simply held up a hand, a gesture that was both quiet and absolute. He informed them that my instructions were very specific and that we were to begin by viewing a short video message I had prepared. He swiveled a large monitor on the wall toward them and pressed a button on a remote. The screen flickered to life. For a moment it was black, and then the sound filled the silent room. It was Susan's voice, first sharp and brittle, complaining about me. Then David's voice, low and conspiratorial. And then came the words that had sealed their fate, echoing with perfect clarity in the high-tech boardroom. His cold, ruthless plan to stick me in the cheapest home he could find. His declaration that I would be all alone. I watched them. I watched the last vestiges of color drain from David's face. I watched Susan's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with a unique horror, the horror of being publicly confronted with your own ugliness. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about their character, their soul laid bare for strangers to see. Mrs. Gable's expression was one of profound, restrained sorrow. She looked at them with a pity so deep it was more damning than any accusation. Just as the silence became unbearable, the image on the screen changed. It was me, sitting in that very chair, looking healthier and more vibrant than I had in years. I was smiling. The me on the screen looked warmly into the camera and began to speak. I thanked my nephew for his candid financial advice. I explained how his words had been a painful but necessary gift, helping me to see with perfect clarity who my real family was. I spoke about Arthur, about our life together, about his belief in community and kindness. I talked about the incredible compassionate care he received from the hospice in his final days and how those people had become a lifeline for me. Then, with that same serene smile, I delivered the final, fatal blow. I announced that the entirety of my estate, every penny held in the Arthur Miller Legacy Trust, and all other remaining assets would be donated to the hospice. The funds were to be used to build a new state-of-the-art wing for patient care to be named the Arthur Miller Wing, ensuring his legacy of care would continue for generations. The video ended. The screen went dark. The silence that followed was deafening. It was David who broke it. He made a strange, wounded sound, half sob, half gasp. He lunged forward in his chair, his eyes wild with desperation, and started begging. He apologized, swore he didn't mean it, that it was just talk, just frustration. He tried to explain the financial pressure he was under, the stress. The excuses were pathetic, dissolving into raw, panicked pleading. When he saw that his apologies were having no effect, the begging curdled into rage. He started shouting, accusing me of being cruel, of betraying him, of destroying my own family over a few stupid words. Susan was just openly sobbing her face, a crumpled mess, her entire world of imagined wealth and status vanishing before her eyes. Through it all, I did not say a word. I reached for the cup of tea Mr. Albright's assistant had placed in front of me earlier. My hand was perfectly steady. I lifted the cup to my lips and took a slow, quiet sip. My silence was a wall they could not breach. It was a mirror reflecting their own monstrous behavior back at them, their hysterics, their threats, their sorrow. It meant nothing to me anymore. They were like ghosts wailing in a room I had already left. Finally, Mr. Albright stood up. His tall, imposing figure seemed to command all the air in the room. He looked down at David and Susan with an expression of profound disappointment. He told them, his voice low and final, that this meeting was concluded. He believed he said that my wishes had been made perfectly clear. He walked to the door and opened it, a silent, unmistakable order to leave. They stumbled out of their chairs, defeated and broken. They didn't look at me as they left. They couldn't. The last I saw of them was their shrinking backs as they were escorted out into the hallway, leaving the wreckage of their own greed behind them. The heavy door clicked shut. The room was peaceful again. Mrs. Gable reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her eyes were shining with tears, but these were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Francis," she whispered. "Thank you." I simply nodded, taking another sip of my tea. The war was over. Justice had been served, and my husband's legacy was finally safe. You could almost feel the shockwaves from that boardroom meeting ripple outwards in the days that followed. The first sign was a call from a second cousin over in Raleigh, a woman I hadn't spoken to in years. Her voice was a mixture of awe and hushed gossip. She said the story was spreading through the family like wildfire. Apparently, after being escorted from Mr. Albright's office, David and Susan had made a series of frantic, self-pitying calls to various relatives, trying to paint me as a cruel, vindictive old woman who had been manipulated by a slick lawyer. But their story, riddled with holes and reeking of greed, had fallen apart under the slightest scrutiny. My cousin told me that no one was taking their side. The story of their threat to abandon me in a state-run facility had become the centerpiece of the narrative. They had become pariahs in their own family, their social standing evaporating overnight. People who had once admired their success now saw them for what they were. I didn't feel a sense of triumph hearing this, only a quiet, somber finality. It was the predictable outcome of a long series of bad choices they had made all on their own. They hadn't been destroyed by my actions, but by the public revelation of their own character. About a week later, I was picking up a few things at the local market when I saw the headline on the front page of our town's newspaper right below the fold. "Anonymous donor gifts millions to local hospice for new wing." The article featured a large, smiling photo of Mrs. Gable. I bought a copy and read it over a cup of coffee at my kitchen table. She spoke beautifully about the gift, about what it would mean for the community. She announced the construction of the new Arthur Miller Wing, a place dedicated to providing compassionate end-of-life care. Reading my husband's name tied to such a legacy of kindness, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. His life's work had been protected. It had been planted in fertile soil where it would grow and shelter others for years to come, far from the grasping hands that had sought to squander it. That was the real victory. My life found a new rhythm after that. The emptiness of the house was replaced by the fullness of a new purpose. 2 days a week, I started volunteering at the hospice. Not as some grand benefactor, but just as Francis. I would read to patients whose families couldn't be there, my voice, a quiet companion in their final chapters. I helped tend the gardens, feeling the good, honest soil under my fingernails. I sat with spouses, sharing stories and cups of tea, offering the simple comfort of someone who understood. I had found my real family, a community bound not by blood or obligation, but by the shared sacred work of providing dignity and peace. I was no longer just a lonely widow in a quiet house. I was part of something that mattered. I was happy, truly and deeply happy, in a way I hadn't been since before Arthur got sick. One afternoon, months after the meeting, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. I was sitting on a bench in the hospice garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I had a feeling I knew who it was. I waited until I got home to listen to it. It was David's voice, but it was a voice I barely recognized. It was stripped of all its anger and arrogance, leaving only a hollow, pathetic core. He was crying. He went on and on, a long, rambling message about how sorry he was, how he'd made a terrible mistake, how he missed me. He talked about his financial troubles, about how he didn't know what to do. His words were a tangled mess of remorse and self-pity, a last desperate attempt to find the old strings of guilt and obligation and pull on them one last time. I listened to the entire message without emotion. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt nothing at all. It was like listening to a broadcast from a distant country I no longer had any ties to. When his pathetic, whimpering voice finally fell silent, the voicemail ended. The phone prompted me with options to save the message or to delete it. With a calm, steady finger, I pressed delete. The message vanished. The last echo of that part of my life was gone. I put my phone down and went back to watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, my heart completely and utterly at peace. In the end, the lesson from Frances's journey became clear. She learned that when people show you their true colors, you don't try to argue or paint them into something they are not. You simply have to believe them. She understood that real strength wasn't about winning an argument, but about calmly protecting what is precious. Her husband had built a legacy of care, and she refused to let it be consumed by greed. And sometimes, true justice isn't a loud, angry confrontation. It is simply the quiet, final click of a door closing on a chapter that has ended.